Kevin Kelly.
Oh, it's so great to be here.
It's so good to see you, man. Last time I saw you, we were at the Next Web in Amsterdam.
It's so great to be seen.
Oh, well.
As my friend John Barlow often said.
It's so great to be seen. I like that very much. Right? Man, I remember the last time we saw each other, we had a conversation about jet lag because I was whining about the fact that traveling the world and giving talks is so wonderful, but also so taxing on the mind and body because of jet lag. And you told me right off the bat, you're like, I don't get jet lag. And I was like, who is this guy? You know? So that was, I remember that was a fruitful conversation.
It's, well, unfortunately, I have no kind of advice about how to do it because it's just something I was born with. And so, unfortunately, I wish I had some secret sauce or method or pill or something that I do, but I don't.
It's just something you were born with.
Just get the right genes and you'll be fine.
Well, it feels like you have been given the right genes for a lot of brilliant insights because, you know, we were having a conversation before about altered states of consciousness and psychedelics and cannabis, and you've never been drunk in your life and you haven't done a lot of cannabis addled rumination or explorations, and nonetheless I find your mind to be one of the most insightful, creative, out of the box minds I've ever come across. Your books have razzled and dazzled my imagination to no end. What technology wants like shook my world, and so it's so wonderful to be here with you. And where does that curiosity come from? Where does this, I wouldn't say preoccupation, but this interest in making sense of technological trends and human creativity from this kind of profound existential aerial view like come from for you?
I think it may derive in part from my kind of natural tendency towards mysticism, combined with my general kind of nerdy attraction to technology. And normally we don't think of those two things as being at all related, mysticism and technology. But, there is a kind of a techno-mysticism. And this interest in mine of looking at systems, whole systems. Yeah. And I think, I'm part of the Long Now Foundation, which is trying to take a long-term view of things. And I kind of realized recently that long view is really taking the view of systems. It's a systems viewpoint. And if you look at things as systems, you automatically have a kind of overview.
That's right.
The big view. And so I have been looking at technology with the big view. And so to get that big view, you have to kind of get out of yourself.
That's right.
You have to transcend. You have to have, in some ways, this sort of distant perspective, and yet for it to be valid you have to kind of remain to be honest and connected on the ground, or else it doesn't make sense. And so trying to stand with one foot in the real here now, and then one foot with the cosmic billions, if you can do that, then I think you can be helpful in terms of looking at, hey, this is where we're going, hey, this is where we've been, hey, this is where we are in the context of the cosmos.
Well, it is exactly your dazzling capacity of like big picture, long view thinking that I find electrifying, particularly with regards to your whole treatise about technology. I mean, for those that don't know, although I can't imagine any of these listeners not being huge fans of yours, but and what technology wants was when I first came across this notion of the technium, where you said that humans are the sex organs of technology, that technology is in some ways has the characteristics of a living thing, and that it uses us to perpetuate and evolve itself in the same way that the bee pollen uses the bees to distribute itself. And this notion of technology, again, the long view as the seventh kingdom of life, there's something that we came out of the biosphere, and then the technology or the noosphere is emerging out of us, and that we are smack in the middle between the born and the made. I mean, talk about like shaking my world. I've always been a sort of geek when it comes to gizmos and technologies and cool tools, but to see this grand narrative and to place us smack in the middle between all that was born and all that will be made, and then us potentially becoming as gods in a way, had such a profound mystical take on it. But here you are, the co-founder of Wired magazine. You can't get more credible in terms of like techno visioneering than you. So how did yeah, this relationship between us and technology, this idea of technology being alive. Can you kind of briefly define that for people?
Yeah, alive is a loaded word, right? I mean, our virus is alive. So I like to say that there's a overlap. There's a continuum between all self-organized systems, which begins at the Big Bang. So the origins of technology are ancient. They go back to the very moment of the Big Bang, when we had something versus nothing or everything. And from that long, continuous, unbroken strand of things self-organizing, from beginning the self-organization of matter and then nucleus and molecules, which are self-organizing into clouds, into planets, into stars, and then at least on one of those stars, self-organizing into life. And then the thrust of all that is this very long arc of increasing self-organization, increasing diversity, increasing mutualism, increasing specialization. All these things that we see over the long term through life have been accelerated when minds were invented to allow life to basically occupy possibilities that it couldn't get to on its own. Possibilities that water-based, carbon-based things just can't make, like a car, like a guitar. And so minds accelerated this movement through life to make technology, which has really accelerated life, and it is making possibilities that wet life could not make. And so I see all that we're doing right now, including this conversation, as an extension of those primeval forces of self-organization that run uphill against the whole downward drain of entropy. And we have this continuous thread of things becoming more complex and more beautiful. And what we are using today, all the technology that's surrounding us in this city and this room, are all extensions of that primeval divine force, which is making interesting things in a universe. And so we're connected. I mean, it's like all the good things that people want to do about bringing good into the world, about the true and beautiful, are possible and made more possible through technology. This is not something that's against life. It's not something that's working against the natural world. This is
the natural world.
The natural world.
Yeah. Well, I agree with you like 1,000%, and I would argue that like so much of my career as a speaker has become simply about telling people something that to you and I is obvious, but to many people is completely counterintuitive. I mean, I cannot tell you how, I guess, narrow or myopic people's notions of tech are. When they think technology, they think, the opposite of a tree. And they think of like rare earth metals that we're mining for, and it's like creating all this horrible pollution, and like the cities are polluted and people can't breathe, and they like technology that's the cause. This is the effect of technology. Technology is the cause of all these problems. And then we're like addicted to our phone, and the software is hogging our attention, and we're feeling more disconnected as we become more technological. I mean, it's this narrow view rather than a much broader perspective. One of the things you said that I think is an example that I often go back to is technology is not just the chip inside of your computer. The musical instrument is a piece of technology. You talk about, if you really want to like see how far we've come and how fast we've gotten here, look upon something like a musical instrument and then imagine if we didn't have it. Like how impoverished would humanity be if we didn't invent the technology of the musical instrument in time for Beethoven? I mean, sometimes I close my eyes and listen to classical music and I am like, that is the technological sublime. But that is also the divine, and that is also God. You know? And if we hadn't made that, technology, the human creative spirit, you might call it, wouldn't have been able to unfurl or unfold mediated by that tool. Or the technology of oil painting, if we didn't invent that in time for Van Gogh, or the technology of the alphabet in time for Shakespeare. Like, those are technologies. Your brain is a technology. The heart is a pump. Like technology is everywhere. It's in nature, and it's also in the made. It's born and it's the made. And it seems once you make that cognitive leap, once the mind is stretched by a new idea, it will never return to its original position. Everything looks different. But most people haven't made that leap. And there's this allergy and there's this fear of tech. And I guess how do we account for that fear? And how do you address, people that come to you and like, us with our arrogant tools,
Right. Yeah. And it's, I think people become afraid when they don't understand things.
Yeah.
There's a power there that they don't understand, and we all can sympathize with that. I think there without a doubt huge problems that are caused by this magic, right? So this magic is not free. It doesn't. All those good things don't exist without many bad things. Okay, so we have to acknowledge that it's not as if this is only good. Each new technology will probably create almost as many new problems as it has solutions. Okay, so we have to recognize that. We have to say, yes, these problems of pollution and stuff, they are true. Climate change is real. So part of the angst about it comes from people looking at that. But and then finally, I think there is people say they like change, but most people don't. Change is hard, really. I mean, if you get good at something and then something comes along to replace it, it's not easy to welcome that.
That's right.
And so people have habits, people have understandings, people have comprehension of how things work, and suddenly it's disrupted. The first impulse is, don't do that. First impulse is that's probably bad. The first impulse. And so I think we have to acknowledge that as part of this dynamic. I think there's reasonable arguments against all those things, or ways we can make them diminished, but they are real. And I think it's a natural. And I think in 1,000 years from now, let's look into the future, 1,000 years, those arguments will still be going. We're still going to have the same, we're going to still be wringing our hands about the new things. And we're still going to be wrestling with the ultimate conundrum about humanity, which will never go away, which really underlines this thing, which is that we are self-made beings. We have invented ourselves.
That's right.
We have invented, humans are the first technology that we made. We're the first animals that we domesticated. We are an invention of our mind. Our language is something we made up. Okay? It was the first singularity, because anything that happened before that, we could not imagine what life was like after language. So we are the created, but we're the creators.
Which is so beautiful. And by the way, that's one of my favorite feedback loops ever, which of course it echoes Marshall McLuhan's famous notion. Of course, we build the tool, and then the tool builds us.
Right. So that dynamic of we are enslaved to technology, but we are also the masters of technology. Yes, we are the children of technology, but we're also the parent of technology. That that tension will be there forever. So even in 1,000 years, we'll be wrestling with the fact that, oh my gosh, we are slaves to this.
That's right.
But we're also the masters of it. Yes, we are being created by technology, yes, but we also are the creators. And so that's never going to go away. And we have to kind of embrace this weird paradox.
Well,
it's what I call the necessary paradox. And I think fundamentally at the very base of the creation of the universe is the necessary paradox.
Yeah. And I think that this understanding or the embracing that paradox is going to require a kind of an ontological awakening or like a forceful reckoning or a new kind of understanding and a new recontextualization of what we are. I mean, right now we think of the metaphor or the symbol of the human species as being like the DNA molecule. I mean, like that's us. But I read this article once, I can't remember where, that was saying that a more apt metaphor for what we are could be the feedback loop. And feedback loops is how systems work. And so if we think of ourselves as actually the product of feedback loops, then we can transcend what David Chalmers and Andy Clark describe as the skin bag bias and realize that actually what the mind is what emerges in the feedback loops between brains, tools, and environments. And our technologies then can be seen as scaffoldings of mind that we use to extend our thoughts, our reach, and our vision. That is a much more apt understanding and metaphor for what we are. And so, yeah, no doubt we are all connected and all is one, because it is one large system. And you don't have to be an astronaut that goes into orbit to have the overview effect, to have that realization. Some people have it when they have a psychedelic trip, you know. And it's not just that we are nature, but we are also not just the born, but we are the made. We are our technology, and our technology is nature too. I think it was James Glick in The Information, where he's talking about this other Parisian biologist, I forget his name, but he was saying that a new kingdom rises above the biosphere, and the denizens of this kingdom are ideas, and that ideas leap from brain to brain. Ideas have infectivity and spreading power. Ideas are not made of nucleic acid, but they have achieved more evolutionary change, and at a rate that leaves the old gene panting far behind. I mean, there is poetry in auto-creation.
Yes.
And there is poetry in this technium, which I believe is what we are. And
if you want something to put on your T-shirt instead of the atom, you put on the Ouroboros, which is the snake swallowing its own tail. That's right. That is the emblem of the feedback loop. That is the emblem of humanity.
Yes. Are you familiar with M.C. Escher?
Yes.
So M.C. Escher has that famous hand that's drawing another hand.
That's drawing itself.
That's right.
Right.
Same thing, right?
Same thing, right.
I've always loved that. I mean, especially when I'm stoned and I look at that photo, I'm like, I see what we are. Are you familiar with the term ontological design?
No.
But you can imagine what this means. So this threw me down an even deeper rabbit hole. So I was thinking a lot about Marshall McLuhan, we build the tools, the tools build us, and this idea that we don't end at the edge of our skin tissue. But essentially, we are constantly being intermediated by everything we interact with.
Is this like the extended phenotype of Richard Dawkins?
In a way, but the idea behind ontological design is that design has a lot more agency than we give it credit, and that the effects of design are a lot more profound than we normally are aware of. And so they build on the McLuhan line. The idea behind ontological design is that everything that we design is designing us right back.
Oh, okay.
So that we are actively designed by that which we have designed. You put somebody in a uniform and they become more conservative in their worldview. You know, a chair that is relaxing makes me feel more at ease, and a chair that is uncomfortable is going to make me more anxious, you know? And so because design designs, that awareness of that can give us more stewardship over what is really the designing of our own subjectivity through the design of our external scaffoldings and environments. And so if the technical material of subjectivity itself is something we potentially have agency over authoring, talk about self-made gods made self-aware, that they are self-made gods, and then the agency and the freedom of realizing, holy shit, where do we want to take ourselves?
Right. And I think that is the ultimate question that we have and that we're going to be struggling with for the next century and beyond, which is, where do we want to go? If we really are these self-made beings, if humanity really isn't a destination but a direction, a trajectory, and we're along this process and we are making humans and remaking them and transhumans into something, what do we want?
Yeah, that's right.
What do we want? And that is like any adolescent will tell you, what do I want to be? Not only is it a very difficult question, but it, in truth, is never answered until you die.
Yeah.
Right?
Oof.
I mean, it takes your life.
Answering the question takes your life.
Right. Answering the question takes your life. It takes a life to answer the question. Right? It takes, it can only be answered by living. Right? And so, this idea, and so in some senses, we're going to answer the question about what should humans be by constantly remaking ourselves and there won't be a kind of a destination, we finally figure it out. It's that we're going to constantly have new ideas and probably multiple answers. And so, but it's going to be the chief not the existential threat, but the existential opportunity.
So well put. And that reminds me of the Walker Percy line. He says, the search is what anyone would undertake if they were not sunk in the everydayness of their own lives. To become aware of the possibility of the search is to be onto something, and not to be onto something is to be in despair.
Right.
And so for me, that search is a reason to get out of bed in the morning. It makes me feel like I am part of the technium in asking the question.
But what's interesting is we have the dual search.
Yeah.
For our own agenda, our own who we're going to be, and then for the human. And that's ideally, we're answering both at the same time.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, what is the answer to what should humans be but the collective aggregation of all the actions of all the humans trying to answer that question for themselves? And so in a curious way, I'm answering the question of what humans should be by designing my own life.
Same.
Okay. Right. Exactly.
I love that so much. And, I feel like very briefly we should talk a little bit about this idea of technology. Even though we can design agency into our tools, because I remember once reading this article about, it was in response to one of these gun violence shootings, and they were talking about, the article was called the philosophy of the technology of the gun. And it was talking, because some people who defend guns will say that it's not, that guns don't kill people, but that people kill people, that it's the person. But this philosopher was saying actually the gun is designed to be shot. So a gun actually has agency. And when you enter into a relationship with a gun, the gun changes you and it changes your set of possible outcomes. And so the idea that guns are value neutral is erroneous, and that we actually have to be a lot more careful because tools mediate us and mediate our behavior. So tools are not always neutral. And I thought that was really interesting. Now, of course, I personally I don't like guns because I don't like anything that puts me in additional danger. But still, it was just, for me, I was like, whoa, because in the past my inclination is always to go with the technology is value neutral. Right, it's a double-edged sword. You can use the alphabet to read Shakespeare and pass down human knowledge, or you can use the alphabet for hate speech, political propaganda. You can use social media to connect the world, and everybody has a voice, and hallelujah, or social media can be weaponized.
Sure.
Fire can cook, and it was our first prosthetic external stomach, and cooking made us human, or fire can burn the village next door. That's always been what intuitively feels right. But now realizing that we can design agency into tools, then maybe the question becomes then, well, how do we design the tools so that they are conducive to human flourishing?
Yes.
Rather than the opposite.
Yeah, and I think for me, one of the ingredients that we would want to design into tools to make sure that they don't become weaponizers, or they don't diminish our humanity, is to always favor things, tools, methods, techniques that increase options and opportunities. And the reason why weapons don't qualify in that is because when you kill someone, you've eliminated options for them, at least, and the world in general. And so weaponizing anything as a weapon is diminishing opportunities and constraints on purpose. And that's why we don't want to favor them. We want to find the job for the technology where it is increasing opportunities, it is forward-looking, it is moving the direction of the weight into the future, which is what options are.
Beautiful. When I hear you talk, and I remember reading your account of the emergence of language as the first technological singularity, And you talked about drawing a line in the sand. And here you had early hominids pre-language and how they could not have imagined once they crossed that threshold the world that came after, right? Like early humans grunting and mumbling and throwing feces at each other. And on the other side of that, you have Shakespeare, you have Beethoven, you have beautiful art, you have cinema, you have Christopher Nolan, you have recursive thinking, you have all this stuff. And how that was like a Cambrian explosion of intelligence right then and there. And you describe language as something along the lines of it's a magic mirror that reveals to the mind what the mind thinks. That we can't even think the way we think without language.
That's right. Right. And it is one of those singularities, like any singularity, singularities aren't visible beforehand. They're only visible retrospectively. And the joke I used to make, which is there's two guys in a cave. They're kind of sitting around and chomping on a drumstick, and they're saying, hey, wait. Do you realize that we're now talking to each other? There's never that moment where we're saying, we're actually talking. Hey, it's a singularity.
Totally.
It never happened.
Yeah.
Never happened. And so I think that's why arguments about a coming singularity are just not going to be seen because they're invisible during that process.
Yeah, and I think, language became the tool through which we felt then compelled and able to essentially exteriorize our inner landscape. Right. From like early cave paintings to perhaps the pinnacle of language and consciousness today, which is cinema. There was this book written in the 70s by a guy called Gene Youngblood. It was called Expanded Cinema. And I love movies, so this resonated with me as like a metaphysical explanation. He said, cinema reflects mankind's historical drive to manifest his consciousness outside of his mind in front of his eyes, right? And then this guy called Bruce Keown or something like that said that the reason we didn't really have to learn to watch movies is because consciousness meets its own process when we watch movies. That cinema is consciousness externalized and reified. Even back in the 1920s or 1912, a guy called Hugo Merstenberg, first writing about the photoplay, the first like video camera, said that cinema works more like the mind than like objective reality. The close-up represents attention. The flashback represents memory. Foreshadowing represents thinking about the future. So in a way, cinema mirrors the way our interior world works more than being an explicit reflection of the external empirical world.
Right.
Isn't that amazing?
I think we're going to have 1,000 times that when we make artificial and augmented reality, when we have smart glasses and we look through and we see this volumetric 3D digital twin. And we can do all kinds of things, all kinds of superpowers. It will be a yet further instantiation of this consciousness, because that's where it's coming from us, and it's coming from our minds, and it's going to what's the word I want? It's going to twin our mind in these digital twins.
So it's Terence McKenna, the psychedelic philosopher, famously said that like human intimacy or intersubjectivity today, thanks to language and music and art, on the one hand, it's really rich. I mean, I can show you my inner world with a poem or with a painting, or I can bring you into my room and show you my books. And you can have some approximation of what it's like inside my mind and heart. But he says that the full emergence of virtual reality will create a whole new kind of intimacy, because I will actually be able to invite you into my mind. And so what new forms of intersubjective communion will emerge when lovers don't have to rudimentarily like rub each other's bodies to try to see each other's insides, but that we can literally be like, hey, step into my heart and mind. Wow.
And I think when we talk about a singularity, I'm bored by this idea that there's some kind of super intelligence, which I think is a complete myth. But I am convinced that this ability, this almost telepathic connection that we would have if we have it in mass, if we have it on scale, if we have an AI-like aggregation of millions of our own minds that are connected in real time and kind of seeing into each other, that makes this uber mind, that is something that we simply can't think about. It's beyond us. It's unreachable.
That's right.
Which is the definition of this cultural singularity.
Yeah.
And it would make everything different thereafter. And that to me seems a plausible route that we're going to be headed towards, which is to link all our minds together, to increase the interpenetration of mind to mind through all kinds of technologies, from pharmaceuticals to electronic, and that when we do, we will have something that has never been on the planet before, which is a planetary mind. And that is scary, it's thrilling, it's unknown.
It's difficult for me to entertain these ontologies without recontextualizing the self. There's a guy called Tim Doody. He's writing about psychedelic experiences, which are essentially profound, massive recontextualizations of the self. And he says that these experiences and these ideas, they recontextualize the self into a marvelous conduit in a timeless whole, from which molecules and meanings flow, from neurons to nebula and back again. Now, most people seem to be able to have a divination like this when mediated by a psychedelic chemical, or fasting for 40 days in the desert by yourself. Like the burning bush only appears when a mind is altered enough that some grand vision can seep through the lenses of perception. I don't know how much experience you have with mind-altering psychoactives, but it seems to me that you are privy to divinations of a psychedelic nature, whether or not you ingested psychotropics. I mean, but it must seem to you like you have seen the light, so to speak, as compared to the default setting of everyday waking consciousness.
Perhaps, but I think it's from listening to the technology. I think the technology is trying to tell us something. I think this world that we have unleashed, I wouldn't say made, I'll say that we have unleashed, again, has its own agenda, has its own biases, and I am trying to listen to what the technology is telling us. Okay, just as you might go out into nature and try to listen to see what nature is telling us. This is a second nature. This is the seventh kingdom of life. This is a bigger nature, and I think we should spend more time listening to it. And I think when we listen to it, it says it's kind of moving in these directions. It's moving into this direction where there's kind of pervasive, universal sentience. It's that everything will have a little bit of a mindfulness, a mindness of many, 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 many varieties and diversities. And just as we filled this planet full of life, we're going to fill it with minds, many kinds of minds, many kinds of consciousness, many kinds of enlightenment. And so and so that prospect is by listening to what the technology says. And it says that, yes, the kind of moments that we have of our own consciousness and our ability to transcend that is not unique. It's not just for this package of meat that we happen to inhabit. It's a general attribute of the universe, and it's a general attribute of anything made.
Yeah. Well, it's one of the things that always it moves me to no end is to marvel, right? To be mesmerized by the sublime characteristics of what has emerged, like designs that do show up in nature, that there are designs in nature, and that the sublime complexity and elegance of these designs can emerge without a designer is a very interesting thing to entertain. Now, I know you identify as Christian, but I imagine your interpretation of what it is to be a Christian is very different from
Jerry Falwell.
Sure, exactly. So how do you reconcile what you think it is to be a Christian?
Right.
I mean, does that mean that you think that your spirit survives death as an entity or pattern of information or personality? Is it a faith in the sublime mystery of a universe that auto-creates itself? Is it a mystic take on Christianity in the same way that Rumi was a mystic, ecstatic poet's take on Islam, perhaps.
Yeah, I'm much closer to Rumi.
Yeah.
And I am a follower of Christ, which was not the last name of Jesus. It's a name of his role. So the Christ is this is the divine, and so my conception. I think you can find out a lot about people by their conception of the origin of the universe and God and not God. That tells a lot about their perspective on the world. And my perspective and my hunger is to basically believe in the biggest God possible. Okay, and so the origin, the creator of this whole thing, it's anything you say about the creation of the world and its origin will be logically unsatisfying to us.
Well, Joseph Campbell said, God is that which exceeds our intellectual capacity.
Right. So it's like if it always has been, that's not very satisfying. Like, well, what does it mean? What does it mean always? Where do always come from? If it's made by a being that, well, where did the being come from? That's not very satisfying. My definition is, well, it's the self-made being. It's the being that made itself. That is the God. Well, that's not very. How does that happen? So there's no satisfaction. All are equally flawed from our small minds, but my unsatisfactory answer that I tend to believe in, because it makes a great story, is that it is the self-made being, the only being that had made itself out of nothing or everything, and that force is the origin of this universe, and that it is basically that universe is something that is contained in us. Okay? The entire divine universe is contained in me. That's the Christ in me. Okay, the cosmic Christ. And so the stories that we have on the earth about this person who had the cosmic Christ, there's a lot to be said for that, but we have to understand what it is that I think the claim is, and the claim is that we can partake in this cosmic story to the extent that we acknowledge that God's in us.
Well, that speaks to me very much for two reasons. The atoms in our bodies were created in the furnaces of dying stars. A statement like that is not a metaphor.
Right.
So there's a literalism there. Like,
right.
actually the atoms that make up our bodies were created, forged in the furnaces of dying stars.
Right.
That should not make us feel like a speck of dust suspended in a sunbeam, as Sagan described us, but rather we are, in his words as well, a way for the cosmos to know itself, for we are the cosmos in some kind of microscopic yet macroscopic form. Like, we are the universe. I'm reminded of, you probably are familiar with Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. He wrote The Phenomenon of Man, and he was a Jesuit priest, excommunicated or kicked out of the church for having an interpretation or a divination of technology and the coevolution of humans and technology that does mirror a bit the interpretation of the technium. And he saw evolution as essentially teleological, which is, I think, another word for exotropic, the opposite of entropy. So you had something that moves towards greater complexity and organization, and it's the same forces that allowed single-celled organisms to get caught up in multicellular organisms, and then they become primates, and those primates get caught up in self-awareness, and then they start to exteriorize their own imaginations and so on and so forth. That has a directionality, right? That's moving towards what was very simple and rudimentary towards something that's sublime and elegant and eventually became a Beethoven symphony. I mean, wow. and that was going to take us to a kind of omega point, which is what, a stand-in for another word could be a singularity, which we've had many before. Or do you have a word you use for where the technium is leading us to?
Right. So my one little kind of disagreement with Chardin, which in generally I adhere to the same kind of large-scale strokes you just painted, is that I think my image of what's happening is more of a radiation outward, a complete kind of an explosion, which is radiating outward. And that evolution, in fact, is not some kind of ladder moving us up to this endpoint of the omega point, but in fact, it is something that's radiating outward like an expanding universe, going out and out and out, almost infinitely. And so maybe there is some moment when the Godhood brings it all back in and returns it to itself.
Yeah.
But I doubt that. I think that it returns by never coming back.
Got it.
All right. It's kind of like a Moebius strip, which is just sort of recurving back into itself. But the one picture, the one little image that I kind of disagree with is that there is sort of an end state. Whereas I would say there's end states. I would say that there's kind of no end. There's just this movement of increasing diversity, of increasing options, of increasing possibilities, this kind of abundance, this superabundance where the mission, my mission, as I understand this kind of picture in my short time on Earth, my mission is to surprise God.
That's so beautiful. There's a line by Flaubert. I'm going to paraphrase it, but he says, "Human speech is but a cracked kettle on which we tap crude rhythms while we long to make music that will melt the stars."
Right, exactly.
And granted, I love language, but I think he was saying that, like, as sublime and magnificent as our poetry is, it's only a pale approximation of what our desire, our existential yearning is. Like, what we want is to make music that will melt the stars, which sounds to me like, I want to surprise God.
Right.
Well, that's the same thing that I want, brother.
It is. So you have this majestic, infinite power conception that could have made everything. But the genius, the game, was he makes beings that reflect some of its own power of creation and say, you make it. Surprise me. It's like that's my Christianity.
Sure.
Is that, and then we ourselves we're going to make other beings that have a consciousness and free will, and we're going to say, surprise us. And
the beings that we're going to create. Oh, so you talked about that too. He says that when we start creating virtual realities with virtual minds, then we'll have an appreciation of our own godhood.
Exactly. Because we'll find out that it's not easy being God.
Right.
It's really tough. Wow. It's really tough because you have to assume the responsibilities for anything that goes awry. And this again comes to my conception of Christianity is how do you redeem? If you make a world and you make beings that themselves start to harm each other, what do you do? How do you reconcile the justice that's necessary with the mercy that you have for your creation? And one of the ways is that you can take upon yourself the price of those things. And so I think once we begin to be gods on a regular basis, whether now or in the long-term future, we're going to realize that there's sort of an art to being God. And I think we may return to some of the ancient religions for guidance in how to be a good God.
That is so elegant. I would like to ask you about peak experiences. You know, there's this whole notion that we spend a lot of time fetching water and chopping wood. That's also part of the human condition, you know, to keep our heads down and to go build the stuff and to get things done and to take care of our family and our community after the ecstasy, the laundry, so to speak.
Right.
But I want to ask you where you go for your ecstasy. And do you think that these moments of ecstasy, when we step outside ourselves, these transcendent moments that nourish us so deeply, are they divinations? Are they glimpses of an unseen order? You know, when you experience aesthetic arrest, you know, Joseph Campbell talks about aesthetic arrest. I know you travel a lot, so I imagine that novelty and encounters that violate your expectations hurl you into a domain of, you know, F. Scott Fitzgerald notion of transitory enchanted moments in which you're compelled into aesthetic contemplations face to face with something commensurate to your capacity for wonder. And I live for aesthetic arrest. You know, I live for the aesthetic orgasm or the musical skin orgasm, the exhilarating neurostorm of intense intellectual pleasure. And now positive psychologists are telling us that any experience of such perceptual expansion or such perceptual vastness that your mental models of the world have to be obliterated and rebuilt to accommodate this new experience leaves us with this lasting afterglow of increased creativity, increased well-being, and increased compassion. So where do you go for your awe?
Right.
Where do you go for your wonder? Where do you go for your ecstasy and aesthetic arrest?
So I'm kind of a person who lives a lot in their head. And so you mentioned Rumi.
Yeah.
I actually, late at night, sitting in a favorite chair, will pull out Rumi and read some and just have my mind blown. And there's blown not in the sense of like this intellectual fireworks, but blown in the sense of an aha, a rearrangement of perspectives of like, I see. And I also just, you know, the kind of trippy science fiction reading where I'm forced to see things from a totally different perspective, like, you know, to imagine I'm a Martian. And that, to me, is as provoking as anything else I could imagine. If I could really, for a few minutes, see humans as a Martian would, that is sufficient for me to kind of have that enlightenment moment, that kind of epiphany. And I think you're right that I do travel looking for those kinds of moments. The most recent one was actually not one that I had. I was in a dinner party last night, and there was a doctor describing his travel with his kids to Pompeii. And he was at loss for words for this moment when he was there with his kids after seeing all these other things in Italy, and then having this moment of this kind of, you know, the snapshot that you get where the volcano ash came and they caught people right in their lives. And he was like, that could have been us. That was, I mean, we're no different. I mean, there could be something right now that just eliminates us right in this moment with the clothes still draped on the on the edge of the bed.
Terrifying to think about.
Well, it wasn't terrifying for him. It was more of an epiphany. It was more of like an illumination, like a strobe of our lives and their relation to the cosmos, which is that it's momentarily, that it's a very short moment. So, you know, he basically, like, he wanted to hug his family and just renew that important thing on this short ride that we have, which is that we're here together and we're on this ride, and our embodiment is a gift that should not be squandered. And so he's trying to make the most of it from that moment. And I think I've had moments like that just traveling, and it's where almost not that it's the esoteric that triggers it, but more of a mundane moment that is shared somewhere that seems strange, and you're reminded of the power of the ordinary in our own lives and how precious the ordinary is, or we take for granted this embodiment. I mean, the image that I have all the time is that there are angels in heaven who are weeping over us because we're squandering our embodiment. We have this ultimate VR ride, which is like we're in this flesh, we're in these meat sacks. We can taste mango, we can hear music, we can have sex, we can feel the wind on our skin. We can have a fight if we wanted to. We can actually affect things. Whereas them and their celestial omniscience, they can't do anything. They can have no effect. They can only look at us and say, oh, well, if I was down on Earth and had a body, I would not be just wasting it watching another rerun on Netflix. I would be doing something else with this body that we have.
And this raises a good question. You know, we began our conversation talking about you being a technologist, but also kind of a mystic, or having divinations of a mystical nature that have informed your views of technology, the way you see technology. William James, the psychologist, back in the day, identified these characteristics that if people had a sufficiently powerful experience that met all this criteria, you know, transcendence of time and place, a sense of the noetic or glimpsing some ultimate truth, a sense of being able to apprehend paradoxicality, holding multiple truths in mind at once, the whole thing. If you met this criteria, that was a mystical experience. That was considered a mystical experience. Now, you know, we're living in an era of unprecedented amount of mental distress. People suffering from anxiety disorders, depression, all these diseases characterized by excessive rumination and rigid thinking, the opposite of cognitive flexibility and openness. The people are trapped in their own lenses of perception. Their past traumas or there's feelings of alienation and disconnection in the past, they are bringing to the doorstep of every moment. And they don't see the world as it is, they see the world as they are. Essentially a generation of people who are traumatized. And what's happening is psychiatry is desperately looking for a new approach. And so psychedelics are having a kind of renaissance. Johns Hopkins University, led by Roland Griffiths, NYU, led by Stephen Ross, Imperial College of London. There's all these places around the world that are now bringing in people who are suffering from end-of-life anxiety, treatment-resistant depression, etc. People who are trapped in their interpretive frameworks that are not serving them. And they are administering LSD, psilocybin, MDMA, and other psychoactives, and in controlled and guided environments are essentially inducing mystical experiences of the type that no doubt you have had and have informed your work and your life and the poetry of what you speak. And Roland Griffiths describes these experiences akin to a kind of inverse PTSD. So in the same way that a trauma can sideline you and warp your world and make it go dark and then make you bring that darkness to the doorstep of every moment with a kind of existential nihilism and fear, that the opposite is similarly true but in a positive way. That a sufficiently beautiful, mystical, enrapturing divination where you see the whole, the long view, the overview effect, as you spoke about before, that can have these like lasting cognitive benefits. So I'm curious as to, you know, as we unwind here, your take on, you know, what was described as potentially being for psychiatry what the telescope was for astronomy, in terms of a capacity to explore and probe the landscapes of inside. The new space is inner space. What is your take on this psychedelic renaissance? And perhaps you can talk about your own experience with LSD.
Yes. So I have very limited experiences. I have had only basically two drug experiences. When I was a teenager, at the dentist's office, I had nitrous oxide on whenever I visited, and I got very, very high, and I had out-of-the-body experiences as a teenager, which in the 1960s were completely unknown. I mean, I had nobody to talk to. I didn't know what they were. It wasn't until the 70s that I even had a vocabulary to talk about them. But they were formative because those out-of-the-body astral experiences were absolutely realer than this life. So I had this glimpse into the real reality behind our imaginary reality. And that stayed with me forever. But then, and that was enough. So I didn't really engage in anything else. Even though I lived among hippies and everybody around was taking, I just didn't have any need for it. But when I was 50, I decided that I should experience a sacrament of LSD. I took it as a sacramental, and this is again before Fadiman and all had anything published about how to do this, how much to take. I searched really far to find anything. There were no guides at that time. So I found somebody, Stuart Brand, and I got some LSD from John Barlow, and I trusted those sources.
Of course.
And I had a sacramental day when I took it, and I saw God. And but it was sort of the word I used is actually a favorite word of yours, which was that it was awesome, awe. If you know the origins of awe.
Used to be also fear.
This is not a friendly awe. This is like, oh my gosh, I am looking at the creator of the universe, and this is like, I need my eyebrows are singed. It's like, whoa. And I felt like...
And you're saying because you felt that your vessel couldn't hold that divine fluid, right? It's like Carl Jung used to say, beware of unearned wisdom.
Right.
So it's like, the faucet is dripping and you can take these divinations, but if you turn it on and it becomes angel falls in your face, like there's no way you can accommodate what's coming in. Is that akin to what it was?
That was very much like it. It was just it was like coming to the edge of the Big Bang. It's like, okay, I'm just going to get run over here.
Yeah, exactly.
So it wasn't this kind of peaceful at one with the universe. It was more like, oh my gosh, I need to stand back. And
did you panic?
No, I didn't. And so I think the result of that was I had a transcendent experience. The kind of mood that I might have expected. It wasn't. It was a different mood. It was still very, very powerful, but I didn't feel like I need to repeat that. And it wasn't bad. It just wasn't like, I'd already believed in the idea that I'm one with the universe and stuff. It's like, okay, I know that.
Yeah. Well, the way you live and the things you write about and the thoughts you have, of course, mirror that divinity. I mean, Terrence or Timothy Leary used to say, "Find the others," and usually, when you recognize something in writing, it's like what you're really recognizing is parts of you. You're like, if something resonates, it's like, wow, this is playing me like a melody. There must be some pattern here that matches patterns in my own thinking, and so we kind of find each other. And so you are psychedelic as far as I'm concerned. Just like Salvador Dali used to say, "I don't take drugs, I am drugs." I don't think that everybody needs LSD to have an LSD-like mystical experience. Clearly, they can spontaneously arise under the right neurochemical conditions. I myself have experimented for years, have intentionally been using cannabis, which is also a plant medicine. And Rick Doblin told me, look, cannabis will take you as far as LSD if you let it. But that has also made me a bit more apprehensive about taking stronger doses of something like psilocybin mushrooms, because my whole thing is I don't want to turn the faucet into Angel Falls. I like the idea. There was a neuroscientist that I listened to once on a podcast who said that human beings are not omnivores or carnivores, we're infovores. And that what we really want to eat is new interpretable information. And I thought it was interesting because he was saying we're basically novelty junkies, we're explorers. But that he used interpretable in there. New interpretable information. That if it's not interpretable, if I can't internalize it or assimilate it or language it or do something with it, I don't want to drown. I want to surf. I want to surf the universe. I don't want to wipe out and be underwater and not be able to breathe.
So these drugs, these pharmaceuticals are technologies.
That's right.
That we've invented. They're as technological as the headphones that we have on right now.
That's right.
And I am completely expecting that there'll be new devices, new molecules invented that will do all kinds of things. And I think part of them will be informed by our continual discoveries of how our brain works, which is something we don't really understand right now. And I think one of the prime forces in understanding how our minds work will be AI. Not that the AI is going to solve it, which it will help, but primarily the trials, the experiments in trying to make artificial minds will be the telescope that we use, the microscope, for understanding how the minds work. And so as we begin to understand how the minds work, we will also pair that with making new devices, some of them being chemicals and others electronic or laser, that could look into our mind, I mean, in a non-evasive way, and actually not only read it, but actually to begin to affect it. And so that the technologies of the psychedelic will explode at that point, and it will have many ways in which we can nudge us in certain directions, in which we could maybe spark a transcendent moment using something that a skull cap that we put on. So I think that would be incredibly powerful because I think the kinds of states that you are interested in, that your listeners are interested in, are part of being human. Yeah. And I think as we make ourselves better humans, that we are going to engineer our ability to do that in a more controlled way, to do it in a more powerful way, and it'll be something that we'll learn how to do better.
Yeah. Well, that sounds a lot like David Pearce out of the UK. He's a philosopher. He wrote The Hedonistic Imperative, which is this wonderful treatise or document in which he advocates for deploying biotechnology and nanotechnology to basically reprogram human subjectivity from the inside out and basically divinize ourselves with gradients of bliss that are way beyond our Darwinian heritage.
Right.
And he writes a lot about MDMA as being a glimpse of the perfect human state, but that of course it's not something people can do every day now because of like neurotoxicity or whatever, but that eventually we can get windows into what's possible for personhood and subjectivity, empathogenic, serotogenic, as he calls it, compounds that we could perfect and modulate and eventually design better minds for ourselves.
And you may not be doing it every day, even when it's well perfected. It may be something like lots of things that we have in our lives that we don't do on a continual basis. One, because of the fact that we get used to things and they're more powerful, but just also because I think part of what we're going to do as humans is to expand the range of things that we want to do. We may not want to be in bliss all the time.
That's right.
And so I think there'll be many mind states that we can engineer. And right now we have a kind of, I would say, looking back from 500 years from now, we'll realize that our language at this time was very, very, very crude because we had only a few words like transcendent or consciousness, when in fact they were like probably 25 things that were all very different, that were actually being squeezed and crammed into this one word because we just weren't sophisticated enough to make the distinctions. But there are probably many different states of things that we now call consciousness that we will later on unravel.
You know, at the tail end of our conversation, I feel like we've what is it that McLuhan said? He's confident that we'll learn to sing the songs that orchestrate the universe. Knowing what you know and tasting what you've tasted and the intellections and the reflections of the poetry, what can you tell people out there who feel disconnected or depressed or nihilistic or anxious? You know, what's your prescription or some words that you might offer them to give them another place from which to see things?
So first of all, it's common, it's normal, it's part of being human is to have these moments. I think the goal is to not have it be the primary thing, as to have other varieties of experiences besides that. So, and I think the way into that is by, for me, it's by seeing or enlarging the environment that we're in to realize that we are part of something much bigger than ourselves, and so it's a way to take ourselves out of our current problem and to transcend that moment of feeling imprisoned, and whatever we can do to hook up or to escape from that into the larger story that's being taken place. And for some people that could be a cause, other could be religion, a framework. It could be something as intellectual as what we're talking about now. It could be something as simple as helping someone else in their own troubles, lending a hand. There are many, many ways, but the solution in general is to get out of that current rut by opening it up to bigger, and without fail, that works. And to the degree that we can learn how to do that, I think that's how we do it.
I believe that's going to be the future of addressing our mental ills is to be able to design for and evoke experiences that obliterate our mental models of the world, especially when those frameworks of interpretation or those lenses of perception are not serving us. A sufficiently powerful inverse PTSD experience has the uncanny capacity to take the lenses you see through and with and make you actually see the lenses. Because by lifting you, by up-leveling you to that long view, you not only see the big picture, but you see the limited myopic way in which you were seeing your own situation before. And that ontological shift seems to be what heals us of our fractures. I'm going to end with these words from this magnificent essay by Ross Anderson. He was writing about the Hubble Space Telescope, and he was talking about, almost in poetic and almost a religious term, of what that did in terms of enlarging our humanity. Couple lines, and then we can close out. He said that to see the images of the deep field photograph through that the Hubble made possible was allowing us to essentially mainline space and time through the optic nerve. You know, feel the richness of that. Again, literally, that's what's happening. We're mainlining space and time through the optic nerves, and that the images were nothing less than an ontological awakening and a forceful reckoning with what is, allowing us to contemplate space and time on a scale just shy of the infinite. And then finally, through the sheer aesthetic force of its discoveries, again, these images of the deep field and contemplating their vastness, and Blake's world in a grain of sand, and heaven in a wildflower, infinity in the palms of our hands, eternity in an hour. Through the sheer aesthetic force of its discoveries, the Hubble distills the complex abstractions of astrophysics into singular expressions of color and light, vindicating Keats' famous couplet, "Beauty is truth, and truth is beauty."
Yes.
Isn't that magnificent?
It is. I get that same thrill when I look at the deep field Hubble images. And it's something that I often refer people to who have any kind of doubts about the power of spirituality, the power of transcendent, and the role of technology in our lives, because it was technology that mainlined that. That was a technological achievement of a high order to send a rocket into space with this camera. And so we are benefiting from that shot of awe because of technology. So I am a huge supporter of our continual technological advance, of putting money into it, of spending time on it, and paying the price of consumer crap. All right, which is the price that we have for these grand achievements. And I think that I also have a, kind of an encouragement to anybody who's working in a company or a field where they feel as if, well, it's all kind of consumer stuff. We're making things that are being thrown away or whatever. Yes, that may be true, but at the same time, you are part of increasing the options of the world, the possibilities. You are somehow making available that next thing for that next Shakespeare or Mozart or Einstein, Van Gogh, who's waiting for that new tool. That we are actually part of this long arc of technology through the universe that's increasing the choices and options. And so we are part of that long story. So we can be proud of the fact that we're working on these things, and even though they seem trivial, they actually, in fact, are one of the grandest things that we could be doing on this planet.
Well, Kevin, I could talk to you forever, but I think we can end it there.
Well, thank you,
so
Jason,
much
for having
your time.
me. It was fabulous.
What a pleasure.
I've looked forward to this for a long time.
Yes,
It's really great to hear your poetry.
Thank you. Likewise.
And for those who are listening, he was not reading this. He was reciting it from memory. I just want you to know. And,
thank you.
It's a real pleasure. And I think what you're doing is very, very important, which is that there is another dimension to this universe, and there's another dimension to this techno stuff. It's deep. It has a spiritual dimension. It has a divine dimension. And I think you are working hard to kind of make that visible.
I don't have a choice.
Well, you may not. That's it. That's your thing. But I think it's an important role.
Thank you.
To do, because I think there is a tendency to think of this stuff as cold, inhuman, disastrous, disease, all these negatives. But in fact, I really believe that this is one of the most human things that we could be doing, that it's overall a tremendous good, and in fact, it is the most human thing that we could be doing.
Thank you, Kevin.
Sure thing.
What a pleasure.
Alrighty.
Cheerio.
Okay.